Welcome everyone to our last week of our Living Lent Kindness Care, Practicing Kindness, Care, and Compassion series. We are so excited to have our guest with us tonight, David Waters. But before I introduce him, I just want to go over a few guidelines for our time together on this platform. Many of you who are here for morning prayer are probably tired of hearing me say this, but I'll say it again. First thing is, and it's a little less important in this environment, but if you can, please share your video. There's something about being able to see your face in this time of isolation, in this time when we can't be together and touch and hug. But if we can see your responses, if we can see your expressions on your face, that makes a huge, huge, huge difference. Secondly, it also helps me to know if the jokes that I'm telling are good or not. Secondly, if you are able to mute when you are not talking, so if you're not asking a question or you're not answering a question, please mute your microphone, and that it really helps a lot with the sound. And then the third thing is, if something comes to mind while David and I are talking, and if you're like me, if you don't write it down, you'll forget it, then use the chat box. Use that, the comment and chat box is up in your right-hand corner to write down your thoughts, any questions you have, or even any memories or things that come to mind that bubble up for you during this conversation. I think those are all the guidelines for right now. The other thing I wanted to do, and I've been doing this at every Living Lent gathering, is, David, we feel like, at least going into the season of Lent, Isaiah 58 was really guiding a lot of our, not just our thoughts, but certainly our actions, and trying to figure out how to live as the prophet and as God calls us to live, not just during a season or over 40 days, but to make it a routine and a practice of our lives. And so I've been reading that passage from Isaiah 58, and I'll read it now. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. And so we started looking around for folks who were doing that work in a lot of different ways, and figuring out a way to put that into their jobs, their careers, or just make it somehow a practice of their daily life. And your name came up, and so we're looking forward to learning from you.
Thanks. That is a tall order, and I feel like I am at least blessed to write about people who do that.
So maybe that's a good segue to introduce you. David Waters is an award-winning journalist. He serves right now as the distinguished journalist in residence at the Daily Memphian. Is that correct?
Actually, it's at the University of Memphis.
Well, I know that you're also the assistant director at the University of Memphis for the Institute for Public Service and Service Reporting, which is a professional newsroom on the University of Memphis's campus.
Yeah, I think the older you get, the more titles accumulate, so it gets a little confusing.
Yeah, you have so many. And how?
Yeah, I'm on the faculty of the university as a journalist in residence, and then ends up being published by the Daily Memphian.
Okay, cool. That makes sense.
Okay.
You've had over 35 years at the Commercial Appeal, where you covered religion and education and poverty and all things Memphis. I found out pretty quickly before I even moved here, one of the first names I heard was your name, and so also said to me that you're a big champion for Memphis as well. So we're really excited to have you, and you've taught me a lot already. You also were at the Washington Post from 2007 to 2010, and wrote and edited and produced the It's on Faith website and the Under God blog, which is also really exciting in a time like this to kind of hear your perspective on faith and public life. So without further ado, maybe we'll get started. What did I leave out?
Oh, that's plenty. That's plenty.
All the awards. There was a whole list of awards, but
thank you for having me, and thank you all for practicing responsible social distancing. Not everybody's doing it.
That is correct. That's right. But we're trying our best too here, and we're trying to figure out technologies to allow us to do that. And so we're pretty grateful for that on a daily basis. My first question for you is one that I told you I stole from Krista Tippett, but it's such a good one and leads to so many other questions. And let's just tell us about if you had a faith or religious tradition of your childhood, and what that looked like and how you think that might have shaped you.
Well, I grew up in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. And I grew up in the Congregational Church, United Church of Christ. And my parents were both very involved in the church in different ways. My dad was a treasurer for a while for the church. And then he also started a community garden at the church and a little bit of a farmer's market. He's a farm boy from West Tennessee. So he liked to play in the dirt, and he found a way to do that at church, which I thought was really amazing. My mother spent a lot of time working on social justice issues. This was back in the late 60s, early 70s. So she was out there protesting the Vietnam War and marching for civil rights and marching for migrant workers and farm workers. And I don't think we ate green grapes or head lettuce for a decade. It was rough being her kid. But she taught me a lot about what church people are supposed to do. And I remember one of my earliest vivid memories of church. The church I went to when we were little was on a corner next to a big, huge, Gothic-looking house. And we used to park the car on the side street and walk around the house to our church. So we had to go around the corner, and every time we walked around that corner, I kept looking at that big old, scary-looking house, and I felt like somebody was watching me from one of those windows. It just was creeping me out. I was 5 years old, 6 years old. So one day we got out of the car and I pointed at the house, and I said, "Dad, who lives there?" And he thought I was pointing at the church next door. And so he said, "God lives there." So I thought, oh, of course. The whole time I've been walking around this house, feeling like somebody's watching me and how creepy it is. It's been God. God's watching me the whole time. No wonder it's freaking me out.
That's an interesting image, first image of God.
Yeah, a little scary. That was my Old Testament version of God, I think. Just watching from on high, not wanting to be wrong.
You can't say that with an Old Testament scholar present.
Oh, well, see, this is speaking as a person who never went to seminary. So you put me out here. And then I think my Newer Testament understanding of God developed from my mother. And I remember this has been in the late 60s. She had just come home from one of her marches. I can't remember which one. And we were talking about it, and I was asking her why she was doing this. And she said if she was doing this because she felt as a Christian, this was what she was called to do. And I said, I didn't quite understand still what it meant to be a Christian, although I knew we went to church. And I said, well, what is a Christian? And I remember her saying, well, I can't really define it for you, but I know a Christian when I see one. And I think from that, I took away this idea that it's not just about what you believe, it's about what you do in reaction and response to what you believe. And I think that has really helped form my understanding of what it means to be a person of faith from whatever faith you come from. And I think that's what's interested me so much about writing about people of faith, is to write about what they do because of their faith. And that's been endlessly fascinating to me.
How did you get into writing? And how, and was faith or a relationship with either a community or a deity, something bigger than yourself, was that part of that decision?
No, actually, part of that decision had to do with Watergate. I was a child of Watergate. I grew up in the 70s, and Watergate was a big deal back then. And I was just so enamored with everything that was happening with the Watergate scandal. I watched the hearings. I was such a geek. I actually watched the House hearings. I was just really intrigued by the idea that these two reporters for a newspaper could do things that would sort of let this happen, to sort of bring down a corrupt administration just by the power of their pen. And I know there was a lot more involved than that, but it just really struck me that that must be a really interesting job. And by then I've been really interested in writing anyway. Got teachers telling me I was a pretty good writer. So I thought about writing, and then I thought being a journalist would be a really interesting way to sort of try to understand the world and get to know the world and maybe make a difference. And also they pay you to write, so that's a pretty good deal. So I started thinking about it in high school, and then I took my first journalism class in college. I went to Miami University in Ohio. And I took my first class and I got a C. And I thought, well, I'm just not getting this. This is not for me. But thank God for Jerry Springer, because this was in the late 70s. And I was failing this class. I was honestly failing this class because the way they teach you to write a news story is they teach you to write kind of like tell the punchline and then tell the joke, tell the big news, and then sort of tell the story behind the news, which seemed backwards to me. It's not really a way to tell a good story. So I just wasn't getting it. It felt really mechanical and constrained. So I was getting D's and F's on all my papers. And then it came time for the last final project of the semester. And we had to find somebody in the region who was prominent. And we had to write a feature story about them, a profile. So we were about 30 minutes from Cincinnati. And I called the mayor of Cincinnati for an interview. And the mayor of Cincinnati in 1978 was Jerry Springer. Did you know that? Before he was Jerry Springer.
I do know.
I know. Who knew? Anyway, I went to his office and he was incredibly gracious and gave me like an hour of his time and answered every one of my questions. And then toward the end of the interview, he started asking me questions. I guess he was getting ready to become a talk show host. And he started asking me about what I wanted to do with my life and how school was going. And I told him, you know, I thought about being a journalist and a newspaper man, but I wasn't really very good at it. I was failing this class. And he asked me what the problem was, and I explained it to him, how it was all mechanical and too constrained. And he said, well, why don't you just write it the way you want to write it? And that had never occurred to me, because I was trying to follow the formula. So I went back to campus that day and I wrote that story the way I wanted to write it. I turned it in. I got an A. It pulled my grade up to a C. And on the way out the door, the professor said to me, hey, why don't you think about working for the student newspaper next year? So there you have it. I owe it all to Jerry Springer. Who else?
Not the Lord or,
Right.
but Jerry. A Lord to some.
Yes.
So
for sure.
So you talked about this a little bit, but it would be interesting. You talked about kind of how you saw getting into writing in your work, but how do you, if someone were to ask you what you do and you couldn't answer, well, I'm a journalist or I'm a writer, how would you respond?
What do I do? That's a good question. I think that has changed over time for me, and I think my response to that has probably changed over time. I remember I started covering religion after I'd been a journalist for about almost 15 years. I'd done a lot of other things before that, just your basic reporting, politics, education, so on. So I asked for the religion beat because I'm in Memphis, Tennessee, buckle of the Bible Belt. I thought that would be a really fascinating beat to cover as a reporter. So I asked for it, they gave it to me. Actually, this was about 10 years after I started. And I was just covering it like you would cover any other beat. I was going to meetings, I was going to talk to some of the major players, I was trying to cover events as they happened, covering denominations, covering big church meetings, covering big churches. And it was okay. It wasn't that interesting. But I just felt like I wasn't really doing it well. But I couldn't figure out how to do it better because it was just everywhere. You know, if you cover education, you cover the school board, or you go to a school, a building, and you go write about what's happening there. But which church do you go to? There's thousands of them. Which denomination do you cover? There's hundreds of them. So I didn't have a focal point. I didn't have a place to sort of go and find stories. They were everywhere. And I didn't know how to approach that. So I heard this story. And it's a story about the Johnstown flood. And it's a story about a young reporter for the New York Times who's sent to cover the Johnstown flood. And he's so excited. This is his big break. And he really was his boss. And back in those days, you had to send your story by telegraph. And you sent it one paragraph at a time. So he went out and did his reporting in Johnstown. And then he went to the telegraph office and he thought, this is my chance. I'm really going to impress this editor of mine, and he's going to let me do big things. So he sent in his first paragraph, and it said, Johnstown, PA, amid a flood of biblical proportions, God sat on a hillside, surveying the destruction he had wrought. And he sent that first paragraph in. And then about a minute later, he heard from his editor, who sent back a telegraph that said, forget the flood, interview God. And I thought, well, I love that story. But it shows in some ways, you know, the arrogance of a writer, thinking, you know, you can write your way out of anything. But it also was something that meant something to me, because it sort of told me, well, okay, I can't interview God by covering religion, but I can interview the people of God, people of faith. That's where the story is. And, you know, we're taught to be objective as reporters, but there's nothing objective about religion or faith. So I was having trouble with that too. But then I realized that it's not about whether God exists or not. That's not my job as a journalist, to talk about whether God exists or whether Jesus is real or anything like that. My job is to cover people of faith, to put a face on my stories and to let them do the talking. And I can be objective about that. I can be fair when I'm presenting their stories. And to me, that's the best part of writing about faith and religion, is you get to write about just phenomenal people, amazing people, famous people, not so famous people, unknown people, who do what they do and are who they are because of their faith. And to me, that's the best story. And that's the way I try to cover not just faith, but all issues, education, politics. Whenever I read about something, last year I wrote a lot about kids and reading issues and kids and brain trauma issues. And I think it's really important, whatever you're writing about as a journalist, to try to put a face on it, to try to find a real human being who can tell that story. And I think that that's not only the best way to help people understand big issues like brain trauma, but it's also a really important way to get them to connect and to see these big stories through the eyes of their neighbors.
Is there a story for you, especially around faith communities or faith, that keeps coming back to you, that you keep coming back to or keep running into, and I don't know, it's always there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I guess in Memphis, Tennessee, it's generally about children in poverty. No matter what I write about, politics, religion, education, government, brain science, I mean, it all goes back to how children are faring or not faring well in this community because of these issues. And I think there's nothing more important that any of us do, whatever line of work we're in, than to try to find ways to help these children live in this community and thrive in this community. And there are so many overwhelming issues in this community. And I think we can all feel overwhelmed by it, by the poverty and the trauma and the violence. And now coronavirus, we can just feel overwhelmed by all of it. But I think if you focus on what you can do to help a kid or to tell a child's story, then I think that makes it more manageable, and we don't lose our minds, and it doesn't make it seem impossible. I remember Mother Teresa reading about her and somebody asking her how she does it. How do you go into this monstrous poverty machine in India, just surrounded by billions of people in poverty every day, and not just be totally overwhelmed by the magnitude of it? How do you keep doing it? And she said, I don't have to worry about that. I just help the person who is right in front of me. And I think that that's something we all have to think about, no matter what kind of work we're doing. Who's right in front of you? Who do you put right in front of you? And what can you do for that person? Or what can that person do to help you?
Maybe that's a really good segue to another question I had sent you, which is, how do you live out your faith, or whatever that means? Like, maybe it's question, what does that mean to you first, that word, and then how do you infuse that or not infuse that into your work?
Well, I feel like I've sort of been evangelized on the job. I think my understanding of faith and my own personal faith were very stratified. In other words, I saw clergy as the professional people of faith, and lay people as sort of the amateurs who were there to support the professionals, right? So it's our job in the pews to support you, the clergy person, because you're the minister. And that may mean we sit on committees, or that may mean we show up and put money in the plate, or every now and then that may mean that we, are sort of inspired to do something outside in the world. But it's all sort of revolves around the professional clergy. And over the years, not just through my job and meeting regular people of faith, but also through my family, my wife, and my kids, and everybody in my little community of faith, I've taken that, I look at that differently now. I read this incredible book many years ago by a woman named Verna Dozier. It's called The Dream of God. And she writes beautifully and clearly about how the church came to be sort of splintered into lay and clergy, how we were all together in the beginning. In the book of Acts, we were all sort of ministers in our own right. And then we separated when the church became institutionalized, and we had the professional class and the amateur class. And that's sort of how things developed over centuries. But she says what we're missing is the idea, not just of the church gathered. We all got that down pretty well. We gather, whether virtually or in person. We know what that means. We know what it means to gather for worship or for Bible study or for potluck or whatever. But then she says we have to remember that we're also talking about the church scattered. So how do we scatter? Once we have gathered and been reminded of the story and who we are and whose we are and why we're here, then we're supposed to go out and scatter as the church, as ministers in our own right. That doesn't mean we all have to go to seminary. That doesn't mean we all have to have the title reverend, or we don't even have to be deacons or elders or anything like that. We all are ministers in some form or fashion, whether we're teachers or nurses. And my God, are we seeing that now more than ever? The way that people in the healthcare system have just stepped up, and they are doing ministry every day. They are going out there and sacrificing their livelihoods and their lives to help people, total strangers, every day. It's amazing. That's a long answer. That's why I have editors, so they can take my long stories and cut them.
how do you fit into that? You talked about everybody else, but what about, what does that look like for you? How are you a minister?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that has changed over time too. But I think I come closest. I don't think I hit it as often as I should, but I think I come closest when I tell a story, write a story that helps people see the God in someone else, the other. So I think it's really important for me as a reporter to be objective in that I don't care what faith you are or what you believe politically or otherwise. That's not my job. My job is to present you and your faith and your beliefs and your work in the truest possible light. And I think by doing that, whether you're an extremely right-wing conservative evangelical or you're extremely left-wing member of the Church of God in Christ, the Church of Christ, not the Church of Christ. There's so many churches. United Church of Christ, to show that there's humanity in everyone, and there's God, and there's faith in everyone. And I think that once we sort of have this common denominator, this common level of understanding each other as neighbors first, then I think we can all do a better job of working together, crossing those lines, and getting some stuff done. So I think that I come closest to being a real minister when I'm able to do that. It's not often enough, but I think I have done
it. What I hear you saying is, as part of your vocation, is to uncover that or to reveal the image of God or human dignity in every single person, and share their kind of unique embodiment, incarnation of that. Is there one story or person that stands out to you, where you, not just as the writer, but as a person, saw the face of God or the inbreaking of the kingdom of God, kind of however you want to think about it, but the presence of God in them?
Well, it's happened a lot. I mean, I'm really lucky. I've seen it countless times in countless different kinds of people. One who always stands out in my mind is a guy named Ed McAteer. Some of you folks who've been around Memphis for a long time remember that name. He was one of the founders of the Religious Roundtable, the religious right, back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. He got together with Falwell and all those guys, Pat Robertson, and really started the religious right movement in the late 70s and early 80s, politically pushing Reagan and pushing other Republicans to sort of do their bidding. And Ed was one of the men behind that movement. He also was a salesman. So I don't know if you ever met Ed or talked to Ed, but he would sell you anything. The reason I use Colgate toothpaste, I used Crest my whole life until I met Ed McAteer, who was a Colgate salesman. And then I started using Colgate. Now I wouldn't use anything else. I don't know why, it was just Ed. But Ed had this, he just had this huge spirit. I disagreed with just about everything he ever said. And sometimes it really made me angry what he said and did. But he just had this incredibly big, open spirit about him. And this generosity on a human level that was just really endearing. And so when I got a chance to write a long profile about Ed many years ago, I spent a lot of time with him at his house, driving to church, hanging out at church, doing various things. And I really feel like I got to know him in a way that it was not a caricature. I think one of the challenges for any journalist is when you're writing about other people is to spend enough time with that person to really sort of get beyond the stereotype or the caricature of that person, and to really sort of figure out the more fully developed, well-rounded human being who's there. And that's not always possible, but when you spend enough time, you can do it. And so I thought when I wrote the story about Ed, it was really rewarding because Ed called me kind of in tears. And he was just so appreciative of what I had written about him and said, you really captured me. You really captured my spirit. But then I also got a call from somebody I knew, another minister, very liberal guy who couldn't stand Ed McAteer, and said, yeah, you really got that guy. You really showed us who that guy really is. And I appreciate that. And so my takeaway was that I had captured the real Ed McAteer, and some people will love him and some people will not, but that's who he is. And I think by getting to know who he really is and what his real motivation was and how it came out of his experience of World War II and, being on a battleship that was blown up and nearly dying and just on and on and on, all these experiences that he had as a young man and as a young married man, that helps you understand why he became what he became. You still may disagree with him completely and think he's doing the wrong thing, but at least you understand. And I think that when we get to that level of understanding, I think one of the greatest definitions I ever heard of tolerance, I talked to a woman who taught at Boston University about religious tolerance, and she said there's different levels of tolerance. One is just sort of a general intellectual acceptance of the other. You may disagree and you may not like it, but it's okay. They think what they think, you think what you think. But the next level down is understanding. And that's really difficult, because how can you understand the faith of another person or where another person's coming from if you don't really get to know that person? I remember having this really long and difficult conversation with some family members about 15 years ago about Islam. And this was not long after 9/11. And they had these beliefs about Muslims and Sharia, and that all Muslims were terrorists and all Muslims wanted us to die. And it was a really difficult conversation. And after about 20 minutes of this conversation, when they were telling me, these lifelong sort of conservative Christians were telling me about the Quran and about Muhammad and about Sharia, as if they were Muslims themselves. So I said, well, what do your Muslim friends think of what you're saying? And of course, they didn't have any. They didn't have any Muslim friends. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as people of faith to know other people of faith or people of other faiths on a personal level. Because I think once we get to do that, and not just across faith lines, but across racial lines, across class lines, gender lines, and so on, the more we get to know the other on a human, personal level, I think we may still disagree, and of course we probably will, but at least we have a more common human framework from which to disagree. And then I think it helps us also move beyond this incredible polarization that we're all experiencing and have for many years. I think that's got to be a people of faith have got to find ways to sort of get beyond that polarization and to get to know the other on a personal level, whether it's Republican and Democrat, Muslim, Christian, gay, straight, it doesn't matter. Get to know others on a personal level.
You talk a lot about telling other people's stories, and I'm wondering, at a time like this, and you mentioned 9/11, and that for 9/11 and also what we're going through right now is such an experience that we're all sharing. And it's one thing to write and to tell and to share someone else's story, but also how do you kind of deal with your own experience of these things when major things are happening?
Well, like most men, I just compartmentalize and push it off to the side. And then that's why I talk to other people, so I can deal with their problems and their emotions and their issues and ignore mine. So that really helps a lot. It's part of my job. It's just what I do. But I do think that it really helps me process my own stuff when I'm talking to other people about their stuff. Just give you one quick example. About 10 years ago after 9/11, I went out and did a bunch of interviews with local folks who were Muslim. and also local folks who were part of the anti-Sharia movement, the political anti-Sharia movement. And I spent a lot of time with folks on both sides, at their house, with their family. And it really struck me after spending time with both sides that they all really wanted the same thing, and they were both dealing with the same problem. They were both dealing with fear. They were both very afraid of what might happen to them and their world as they understood it. And they were both really, all they wanted was the freedom to be who they were. And I think once I understood those common denominators, it really helped not just me tell that story, but to help me process my own fears and my own yearnings for us in this time. So I think I've been really, it's not like being a counselor so much, although, you know, you sit and talk to people about their deepest, darkest emotions and fears and concerns and experiences. You sort of become a counselor in some ways because you're sort of taking it all in, absorbing it, and you're really listening. I used to worry about going to talk to people about, you know, their child who died or their spouse who'd been hurt tragically and all these other difficult issues, like I was really intruding on their lives and I shouldn't be there. But I had one woman tell me, who had lost a child, she thanked me after I talked to her, and she said, it's just so nice to talk to somebody who really wants to know this stuff, who really wants to understand and to learn and to listen. And I think that that's something we all are capable of doing. We all have that ability to minister in that way to each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge gift in that moment. I feel a long time ago, before I was a pastor and before I did anything in nonprofit world or anything, I worked in sales, and it was a similar experience where I would go in and end up, we were supposed to be talking about selling an advertising package to them, and we would end up talking about the child who passed away, who they think about every day, or something going on, broken marriage or broken relationships. And it was that need to have someone else and almost outside of their daily lives just be present and listen. So I have one more question, and then I do want others, if you have questions, either you can be typing them or thinking about them, and don't be afraid to ask. Actually, I guess I have two more questions. The first one is, do you have any either spiritual or not so spiritual practices or routines that help you to journey through this season of Lent or to journey through life?
Well, I was blessed to marry my spiritual director. I didn't know at the time she was going to be my spiritual director, but that's what she is, and she became. So she keeps me on the straight and narrow. She keeps me in disciplines that help me do that. And one, of course, is worship. I think it's really important, however you worship. I think having that community experience, and now it's online, but to have that community experience where you gather and are reminded. And I love the word reminded because you can break it into remind. You know, you're like reminded, because the culture can just sort of take your mind and run with it and sort of pull it away from your groundings. And I think it's really important to go back on a regular basis to be reminded by the story. And I think it's really important also not only to worship with the story, but to spend time in the story, the Bible, but also people who, spiritual giants, spiritual mentors who understand much more about it than I do, people like Brueggemann and Bonhoeffer and, you know, Bono and all the great B's. And so, you know, whether it's a weekly Bible study or just sort of some sort of weekly study in community, one of the things that we have a pastor we've known for a long time. One of the things he taught us was that the Bible is not necessarily meant to be read and understood in isolation, that it's meant to be meant to be read and discussed and understood in community. Because I'm going to hear something you didn't hear, and you're going to hear something I didn't hear, and that's really important to have that feedback. So we try to do that once a week. And then my biggest challenge, we also try to do some silence every day. We're supposed to. I'm not really good at that. Stillness. And you don't have to be necessarily silent, but still, just so that you're not plugged into anything, you're not on any device, you're not reading, you're not even listening to music, you're just still. And even if you can just do it for 15 minutes, I mean, I think that's also a way to sort of recenter and to remind and to sort of guard yourself against all of the stuff that's whirling around you all the time in this culture. So those are the three that I try to maintain on a regular basis: worship, study, and stillness, with varying levels of success week to week.
Well, that's when we call it a practice, right? We don't
Right. Yeah. We practiced it for a long time.
I guess my final question is just, how are you doing?
How am I doing? Oh, with all this stuff going on?
Yeah, not just like the fine, thank you, but how are you?
Well, thanks for asking. I'm good. All my wife and my kids are good and healthy and generally off the payroll, and they're all nearby, and I am blessed beyond belief. But we're all anxious. This is a really difficult time, and because we don't know what to expect, we don't know what it could change tomorrow. It could change an hour from now. I don't know if I've ever experienced anything like this. Maybe it was like this in World War II or during the Depression. I don't know, but this is brand new for so many of us. And I think it's really interesting in some level that it's happening during Lent, because Lent is supposed to be the time of self-denial and self-examination and preparation, and we're sort of now on this self-imposed Lent. We sort of have to do that, and I think it's really important for us to take that seriously and to take this time to be more mindful of others and of God. So, working on that.
I think we all are. Not easy for any of us. We've gotten used to a different rhythm.
Yeah, and for some difficult people who've lost loved ones, it's just tragic.
Are there questions? Please remember to unmute yourself if you have a question. Sounds like someone's working near your home.
Yeah, I'm outside the window.
Questions?
You asked really good questions, by the way. Have you ever thought about being a journalist?
I went to my undergrads in journalism.
That's right. I should have known.
I think my husband has a question. I see his mic is off.
Yes, I do have a question. First, thank you. I think it was really interesting. I'm really fascinated in journalism and what sort of motivates people who are in that field, and just some of the stuff that you've talked about related to the things that motivated you to get into that field were really resonated with me. And one of the things that came up for me is this idea that truth is really central, both to people of faith and also to journalists. And I'm interested to know sort of how you see both of those, truth in journalism and truth in faith, and how those two can be complementary to each other.
Well, that's a great question. Hi, Matthew, by the way, and welcome to Memphis, and thanks for coming to Memphis. We're glad to have you. Truth, big topic. truth in faith and truth in journalism are two entirely different things. And I think that's one of the things that I had to learn as a religion journalist, was that it was not my job to figure out the truth of faith. That we all have our own truth when it comes to faith, what we believe. And my job as a journalist is to deal with facts and to try to gather and compile and present facts in a way that helps people understand more about the world, the real world around them. And that is true whether you're writing about politics or faith or anything else. I think the facts have taken a real hit in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think one of the reasons is that we have lost so many journalists over the past 10 years. The newspaper business in particular has been devastated over the past 10 years. The Memphis Commercial Appeal used to have 200 full-time journalists, and now there's about 20. And that's true across the board in New York and from New York to LA. We have lost so many on-the-ground reporters who spent their days going out and trying to gather facts about what was happening in our communities. And we've lost that. So I think we've lost some of those relatively independent. None of us are totally objective and none of us are totally unbiased, but we do try to be fair and accurate and neutral as we can. But we've lost that. So I think that's taken a real hit. The other thing that's happened is that social media has exploded, obviously. And that's a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because we've just been deluged. It wasn't just cable news 24/7 that inundated us with news and information and facts. And now it's social media, and we don't know where it's coming from. We don't have time to find out. And we don't know if it's Russia or Reuters or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or some guy sitting in his mother's basement in Toronto. We just don't know. And so I think that the current millennial generation has a much more difficult time. We used to be called the gatekeepers, and maybe that was too much responsibility and too much power for the media. It probably was. But now we don't have any gatekeepers. And so all the information just floods us all the time. And I think it's really, really difficult for any of us to try to filter it and sift it and figure out what's correct and what isn't, what's fact and what isn't. So I think the job of a journalist is more important than ever. I think what we're seeing with the coverage of the coronavirus worldwide, we're getting our facts from on-the-ground reporters who are talking to health professionals and medical professionals and government leaders and so on, and people who are being affected by this. And that's where we're getting our information. And I think it's more important than ever.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I know you have some that you're thinking about. Don't be afraid to voice them.
Steve, you don't have an essay question for me?
I think given your interpretation of God in the Old Testament, maybe he should have that.
Yeah, I'm going to fail that class.
But I think this is also the time, it doesn't have to be, I think sometimes we have to ask a question about your profession or about specifically your faith, but this can be broader than that. This could be just an interest that you have. So any question is a valid question, and I'm sure David will say if he doesn't want to answer it.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing from you all about how you're dealing with virtual church. What is that like? Is it okay for now? What do you miss? I miss being in the space with people, of course, but also just being in that sacred space. Hey, Steve.
Hey, David. Sorry, I'm still learning this this media stuff. That's what I miss, face to face, and having to go through this.
I remember that.
But yeah, well, I do. I miss the beach, the passing of the peace. And my personal space is very small, and I'm not a natural passer of the peacer. But that and the things that we can't really do right now because of the social distancing and all of that. That's tough. I wish I had heard your image of the old house a long time ago, because that would have come in helpful in the waning chapters of Ecclesiastes, where you have either this deteriorating house or a body, sort of the God of the Old Testament there, the God of the old house.
Right.
But I'll say this and leave. It occurred to me when Peggy Jean said something about how you are a minister, and in some ways the task of journalism is that of gathering and then scattering, which clergy do in many ways. I mean, you gather the facts and then you scatter them. And I've been the recipient of your scattering through your work at the Commercial Appeal for so many years. And it's a very fundamental vocational ministerial function that you performed in that capacity and continue to do. So thank you for that.
I've always liked the Gospel of Mark. Of all four Gospels, that's been my favorite. And I think it's because Mark is just so straightforward in his reporting. He doesn't embellish. He doesn't go off on tangents like John, with long speeches and sermons. And he just tells what happened. This is what happened, and then this is what happened, and then this is what happened. And I love that. It's just so straightforward. You just get the facts.
Pat, do you have something? You keep kind of going on and off of.
There she is.
Well, I'm not getting great reception, so I've missed. Can you hear me? I've missed a lot of what's been said, but your question, David, was how is this virtual thing working for us?
Yes.
It's not the way I would love for it to go, but it's keeping us connected to our church family. Can't be there with them every Sunday. We can't sit beside them. We can't do our music. We can't do all the things we're accustomed to doing, but it is a way to keep connected. And I am thankful that we're able to do that, because we would not have seen you tonight if this had not been possible.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think the first time I realized the value of digital technology and social media was when we moved to Washington back in 2007. And my son at the time, our youngest, was going into 9th grade. And obviously it's a very difficult move for any kid, but especially when going into high school. He grew up not only in this town all his life, but in this house all his life, and we moved him. But I think it was less of he had a less difficult time and a shorter transition time, because he was able to stay in touch with all of his Memphis friends all the time, either on the phone or by text or on Facebook, FaceTime. And I think that has not only helped the millennial generation stay in touch, but it's helped all of us stay in touch. I'm in touch with friends from high school that I never would have been in touch with without Facebook. So I do think that there is some real value in how it has allowed us and encouraged us to stay connected to people in our lives that we wouldn't have otherwise.
Maybe we have time for one more question or one more comment if you want to share about how this churching virtually is going.
While we're waiting, I'll just say one more thing that has struck me over the past couple of weeks. I've been talking to a lot of ministers and a lot of people about how things are going. And everyone is just so frustrated by the fact that this is the first time that they can remember that as people of faith, their response has always been during times of crisis to reach out and help people. personally, physically, in any way they could, by giving people shelter, giving people food, giving people clothing, just doing things for people, with people. And now the very act of reaching out physically can put you and the other person in harm's way. That's a really difficult thing to try to reconcile as a person of faith. And I think that's one of the things that most people seem to be having trouble with. You can't reach out and help, because if you reach out, you might be putting somebody at risk.
Yeah, I think that's been extremely hard for us. We ended up having to delay our full opening of our pantry, which was going to be which will be a kind of shop as you want, kind of Sarah Miles version of a pantry. So it's going to be from the sanctuary, from the communion table. And in that way, it's not possible right now, especially because most of our volunteers are over 65. So we decided to open as needed for individuals, but it's certainly not the same. But I also am, for us, I think especially, and I assume it's for like this for other kind of urban and suburban churches where kids have grown up and moved away. Right now we started daily prayer every morning at 10 during the weekdays, and then on we have our Sunday worship. We've been having people who have videoed in or come on and joined us from New York and from California and from North Carolina and from Atlanta and from that have moved away or don't have a church family and are coming to us in this time. And I do think our I guess spiritual imaginations are being challenged to figure out how the Spirit might move among us in different ways than it has before, which is challenging but exciting.
Yeah, I just saw a study today on Religion News Service that said that while giving is down, church giving is down, church attendance is up. And it's because everybody's going online and they're just having more people show up. Yeah,
I was listening to some faculty from Lutheran Seminary, and they said, they were talking about this moment, and they said, this is what the church is made for. Maybe we weren't expecting it to be in this this form, but this is what the church is made for times like these.
Amen.
If anyone else have any other comments or questions? If not,
every possible question. You've done a good job.
No. I've certainly not asked all the questions, but if not, I mentioned to you in an email that one of the things we've been asking folks is to bring part of their tradition or some ritual into the space with us and to share in that with us. And so is there, I know that you have a community that you live out your faith with. Is there anything either from that community or from your home life or work that you could send us out with, a blessing, a mantra, a poem? It can be, think broadly about what it might be.
The first thing I thought of was a tradition that we started, our little faith community started about 15 years ago. And we get together every New Year's Eve and we have a good time. But at the end of the evening before midnight, we all go around and name our coming year. We don't make any resolutions. We just say this following year is going to be our year of whatever. And it's sort of a way to help us stay focused and stay centered to remind us of something we want to work toward or something we want to lean into this coming year. And it sort of becomes a mantra throughout the rest of the year to kind of bring you back. And it's also sort of a commitment. So in that way, we're sort of holding each other accountable for doing that. So every year we name our year, and I can't tell you how many people I've told that to who have decided that is the greatest idea they've ever heard for New Year's Eve, and they're doing it too. So you might want to think about that next year. I think it's a really it's a really good way for people of faith to make that commitment and to just sort of help themselves be disciplined and be reminded of something to focus on in the midst of all the chaos around them.
Can I ask what your community decided to name this year?
Oh, no, we all do our own. It's individual.
Oh, you all do? Okay. So this
Yeah.
is kind of like our, we did Star Words. So we don't necessarily choose them though, but it's something we do for Epiphany, and everyone chooses a word in the congregation and kind of focuses on that word for the year.
That's good. That's great. Yeah. Well, I don't know why we didn't think about doing that. That's a good idea. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much. I just pray that you and your family are safe, and I'm looking forward to this next season because I think that talking to someone earlier today, and I certainly think that in this Lenten season and in this season of pandemic, that we will be changed and transformed into something new. And I'm excited and hopeful in humanity in this time.
Good.
All right. Thank you.
People of faith are not necessarily optimistic, but we should be hopeful.
Yeah. Yep. Anything else that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
No, you did great. Thank you for having me. Really good to talk
Thank
to
you so
everybody.
much. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.